Dear friends, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. And first, let me wish you a very happy New Year. And we are very, very excited to kickstart this new year under the shining star of pioneers and explorers. So this is very exciting. Tonight we are going on an adventure together. We're going to dive into underwater caves. We're going to climb the highest mountains in the world. And we're going to explore polar regions. And all of this at once and without any travel inconvenience, I hope. So exploring new spaces, discovering landscapes and going beyond their own personal limits. This is what our speakers tonight do regularly. And as modern day explorers, not only do they help build up and extend our scientific knowledge of the Earth, but they are also advocates for environmental protection. And as you know, this is a priority for France that we continue defending. None of this is conducted in abstracto, and these are also very personal adventures for all of the speakers. And our guests are people who are committed to expanding human physical boundaries, and they explore sometimes, most of the time, the different spaces they explore in very difficult conditions, and indeed discover their own physical ability and put them to test very bravely. So it's a great pleasure, a great honor, and I am very excited, I have to say, to welcome tonight our three very fascinating speakers. They will talk about three different, completely different environments. On the underwater side, we have Nathalie Gibb. Nathalie, you're an American co-owner of a cave diving center and a scuba diving instructor. You've been teaching to the young and the less young. And moreover, you use scuba diving to explore and chart Mexican underwater caves, the famous cenotes. On the mountain side of things, we have Vanessa O'Brien. Vanessa, you're a world-famous mountain climber. You're an explorer and a former business executive also. You recently became the first American and British woman to successfully summit K2, and you know that K2 is the second tallest mountain on Earth. You also you just managed to climb the highest peaks on every continent, and have received for such an achievement a Guinness World Record for the fastest time a woman first achieved this goal. Wow, this is impressive. And going to the extremes and to the poles, we have Luc Hardy. So you're a very good friend of this Consulate. You're a successful French entrepreneur, a 21st century adventurer, a prolific author, and a passionate environmental advocate. You funded the Pax Arctica initiative, and you are organizing in this framework scientific exploration in polar and glacier region. And you aim at raising awareness for the environmental issue in doing so. And we are very grateful, finally, to Jim Clash. Jim, you have accepted to moderate this panel. You are also an adventurer and a business journalist, and you work at Forbes since 1993. Your own adventures include expeditions to the North and South Poles, climbing the Matterhorn, the Aconcagua, and Virgin Peaks in Greenland, and Antarctica, so you're perfectly at ease moderating this panel, and this is clearly not foreign to your own experience. So I hope you will enjoy this night. I'm sure it's going to be fascinating and exciting. And without further ado, I'm going to leave us to our guides and leave us be guided to these uncharted territories tonight. Thank you very much and enjoy this evening. Bye.
Well, thank you, Consul General, and welcome to all of you who came out tonight. My notes say thank you and thank all of you for coming out on this cold night, but I wrote this last week, so it's a little warmer tonight. When I was approached to moderate this panel, my initial reaction was hesitation. Most of my adventures and the people I've interviewed have been 20th century explorers. So I wondered, what am I doing talking about 21st century exploration? In the past, I've interviewed Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Everest, 1953. Sir Roger Bannister, the first man to break the 4-minute mile in 1954. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the first men on the moon in 1969. And Don Walsh, the first man to the bottom of the Mariana Trench in 1960. Then I thought, well, my own adventures have also been traveling in the footsteps of other great 20th century explorers. When I climbed the Matterhorn, of course I was climbing in the footsteps of thousands of people, including Edward Whymper, who first climbed it in 1865. When I drove a Bugatti at 250 miles an hour, I was laughing because the world record actually is 768 miles an hour, set by a guy named Andy Green in 1997. And when I skied to the South Pole, I couldn't help but think about Roald Amundsen and Robert Scott in 1911 doing it. So I just wondered, what am I doing up here? I even have a ticket to fly in space with Virgin Galactic. But again, what's the big deal? Over 400 people have flown in space before me. So again, looking at the past. So just what is exploration in the 21st century? Has it all been done? We have 3 people skilled in different areas to tell us differently. Luke Hardy will address the audience on polar exploration and climate change. Nathalie Gibb will talk about cave diving and the oceans, and there's a lot of opportunity for exploration in the oceans. And then Vanessa O'Brien about the giant mountains in the world and the ones she's climbed. You know, when I interviewed John Glenn, the late John Glenn, and also James Cameron, the great movie director, I asked both of them, what is exploration? And the answer they give is pretty interesting. They just said 3 words, and they said it separately. Curiosity in action. Exploration is curiosity in action. And so in the 21st century, I don't think humankind has changed. We're all curious, right? And we are going to take action on that curiosity. So, without further ado, let's get to our speakers. First up is Vanessa O'Brien. She's a mountaineer and former banker and a member of the Explorers Club. As we know, she's the first British and American woman to summit K2, one of the most difficult mountains in the world. She's also climbed Mount Everest. So we've got a real mountaineer here. So without further ado, take it away, Vanessa.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Do I have to turn this on, or can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. I would like to start by saying it's wonderful to be here, to thank the Consulate of France in New York for hosting this event and choosing exploration in the 21st century as its first topic in 2018. I think that's fantastic. I'd also like to thank Anne-Claire for being here herself to preside over the evening. I think that's fantastic. And her staff for putting together tonight's events. And also my fellow explorers, Luke, Nathalie, and Jim for being here, and all of you guys for coming out tonight on a rather warm evening. As Jim suggested, my adventures have been on the mountains. And so I will start you off this evening with the mountains. Let me try my clicker from here, or here, or even here.
This always happens
Okay,
in
you want to
presentations.
just advance? Okay, perfect. So I've spent my time really focused on getting to the top of these large peaks. And usually they're over 8,000 meters or 26,000 feet or 28,000 feet, and they're quite a challenge. And this is the view of what they look like in a photograph. But it hasn't always been the case. I spent my first 20 years really in a corporate environment focused down here, if you could advance me along. See these 5 little red dots? These are the tallest buildings in the world. Burj Khalifa is the first one on the right. That's in Dubai. These tiny little buildings, the largest buildings in the world, pale in significance to the tallest mountains in the world. They're about, it would take you about 11 times one of those buildings to get to the top of an 8,000 meter peak. But my first 20 years were spent in banking and financial services before I became an explorer. And part of what we were asked to do tonight is talk about our transition to exploration. And I had a catalyst. My catalyst is in Wikipedia, and it's called the Great Recession. The IMF called the Great Recession one of the worst financial things that happened to the global economy in the 21st century. And when that happened, I decided to embrace change. And by embracing change, what I did was I sought to do something different. And by different, that was something that did not involve financial services. And living in London and Hong Kong, when I heard the word Everest, that was it. I had a theory, and the theory was that climbing, alpine climbing and mountaineering could be taught and therefore learned. But there were two things I didn't know, and that was whether I'd be any good at it and whether I'd like it. But I was about to find out, because I couldn't get the term Everest out of my head. If you could advance me one more slide. How many people were in New York last Thursday, 1 week ago? If you could play this picture for us. If you were in New York 1 week ago, this is what you experienced. This is snow, cold, and wind. Voila, we are all mountaineers. Because this is what it's like on a mountain. Only I do it for about 16 hours. I'm usually climbing, and there's a lot less oxygen. But if you were in New York last Thursday, you too were a mountaineer for a day. If you could advance me one slide. I just want to point out two things on this. One is the back row. There are 14 mountains that are over 8,000 meters or 26,000 feet. They are all in red. These are the 14 8,000ers. Peaks over 8,000 meters. They're all red because they're all in Asia. 8 of them are in Nepal, 5 in Pakistan, and 1 in China. These are the ones I climbed today. The ones in the front row are the first and second tallest peaks, or the 7 summits. The reason I put first and second is they look better against the big boys in the back. So when I said I climbed the 7 summits, it would have been just the first in the front row. The other thing you can see is the contrast between, say, Everest on the far right and, say, Kosciuszko on the far left, which is the tallest mountain in Australia. There's quite a dramatic size difference. But the other reason I like this is because once upon a time, and Jim hinted at this, the original World Cup, as I like to call it, was about mountaineering. Nations proved that they were the best by seeing if they could conquer the world's highest mountain. And never have I been somewhere where I could say this. And if you could hit one slide for me. France took the World Cup by being first to climb Annapurna. Absolutely, round of applause. Because Maurice Herzog in 1950 was the first to conquer Annapurna in Nepal, and that was the first to ever conquer an 8,000-meter peak. To me, this is the original World Cup. This is when countries competed to be the best in what they did. One more slide shows us that also Everest, 3 years later, the Swiss and the British went after, at a time when only one country at a time could compete for permits, who would be the best. Sure enough, in 1952, the Swiss had a permit. In 1953, Sir John Hunt led what would be Sir Edmund Hillary. Today's the anniversary of his death. And Tenzing Norgay to the top. They, by the way, were the spare, not the original 2, many don't know that Sir John Hunt chose, but they got there. In K2, the Americans and the Italians fought for that mountain. The Americans were there in 1938, 1939, and 1953. The Italians snuck in there in 1954 and took the summit. Because the Italians took K2 on, much like Sir John Hunt did, in military fashion. But they got there. The original World Cup. For me, one slide was only about Everest. That's all I wanted. Could it be taught and could it be learned? So it took me 2 years to train for. I got there, not until there was one hiccup, one failure. As people will say, success is a lousy teacher. I think that's a Bill Gates quote. But after eating that humble pie, I was able to go on and get the 7 summits. If you advance me one, Advance me another, and you'll see there's a couple 8,000 meters after that. And advance me one more, and you'll see K2 gave me quite a bit of trouble. We'll talk about that. One more, and one more. So there is one more thing about the 8,000 meter peaks. There were 3 Olympic gold medals once upon a time. Many people don't know that. Those Olympic gold medals were for, and I just want to get this quote because this is the founder of the Olympics, "We salute the most beautiful kind of heroism, that which confronts scientifically calculated danger step by step without hesitation or sensationalism." I love this quote because those Olympic medals went in 1924, 1932, and 1936. They were called off after World War II because it was deemed too dangerous. What kind of heroism do you think we're talking about? We're talking about the kind of expedition that even happens today, that takes 8 weeks, the type of logistics where you have to put together going 300 kilometers in the middle of nowhere, another 100 kilometers on foot with maybe 9 tons of gear, 350 porters, where there's objective dangers such as crevasses, avalanches, and increasingly with climate change, rockfall. Weather is never your friend. We're talking about what we saw here, cold winds, deep snow, some of the, frostbite where you have increasingly dangerous temperatures, 40 below and worse. Success, they used to say, in alpine climbing was merely surviving. That's the kind of heroism that they were talking about. I'll show you it on the next slide, just a brief video of the summit footage on K2. This took 1,096 days.
This actually happens. Sometimes I have to pinch myself because, we went through some really, really tough conditions. With the high winds and the deep snow and precipitation that was building. It's still hard to believe that summit day happened and that we were able to persevere. Very gracious that the mountain allowed us to summit this year. Of course, it took 3 years, and there's no guarantee of a summit on K2. But I'm deeply honored that we were able to do so this year. Over 3 years, there are signs of climate change on Earth. I remember last year thinking, wow, I'd never seen glaciers like this, and how high I was, and how magnificently tall they were. And this year I felt like, wow, I was walking on something so much more deflated. That although there was all this snow and ice and everything here on the mountain, that somehow, yes, there were these rivers and they were running quite strong. And they were melting. Now, could that rephrase? Of course it would, but they won't become the big glaciated buildup that they were before. From 95 minutes. Thank you, Pakistan, for just completely supporting me through my 3 years here. I have loved traveling here. I'm so proud of our team of 12 that made it, but I have to commend the individuals and the larger expedition for choosing the summit because there's nothing wrong with it first.
And I'll just leave you with a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which simply says, "Never confuse a single defeat with a final defeat." Thank you so much.
Well, that was pretty thrilling, wasn't it? Next up is cave diver Nathalie Gibb. She's also a member of the Explorers Club.
No.
Oh, you're next? Okay. Next up is Luke Hardy. They changed the order. A French-American citizen from Brittany. He's also a member of the Explorers Club. And he's head of NGO Pax Arctica Initiative. He conducts scientific expeditions and has traveled to the remotest corners of the world to raise public awareness about environmental causes. Let's have a hand for Luke.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Anne-Claire, for this opportunity to present here tonight. And Happy New Year to all. Lots of exploration and discoveries in this year 2018. Just briefly gonna introduce myself here. I've been an adventure explorer since about 20 years. This led me to explore, so to speak, environmental issues, first with the Cousteau Society in the late 90s, and then with the Green Cross, the NGO of Gorbachev, and then through my own initiative, Pax Arctica. And all this in a parallel to my entrepreneur investor life between France and the US. The originality of what I do is maybe explained in a mix of science. So I always tend to bring scientists, specialists in one area or the other in my expeditions. I also tend to bring youngsters, students, so that they can learn about the areas where we are going and the subjects we are covering. Like also to look at history, who was in these places where I'm going before, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And also, as I said earlier, an eye on the environmental issues related to the places where I go. I also like to talk about what I'm doing, what I've seen, discovered, relay the messages of the people I've met, the scientists I've worked with, through books and films. I did a film 3 years ago about Shackleton expedition in the Antarctic, and the 2 films coming, one on Cuba and one on the Russian Arctic coming out in a couple of months. I tend to sponsor my own expeditions, but I'm happy to have partners, so if you're interested, let me know. Tended to cover very diverse geographies, although I'm kind of modestly known for Arctic, Antarctica, glaciers and mountains in not quite the K2, but Himalaya, and glaciers in the Wenzhou Mountains in Uganda, but also the jungles of West Papua with the Korowai tribes, and more recently, thanks probably to the inspiration of Jean-Michel Cousteau, who is the head of Green Cross in France, I'm more and more interested in looking at the oceans and doing some expeditions in that space. Also, as I'm getting older, it's getting tougher to get to these high places. Future projects are Russian Arctic again, looking at wreck recoveries, going back to Cuba to look again at the coral reefs we looked at this last July, Pitcairn in the Pacific, the Atacama in Chile, and other projects which are not necessarily physical but are quite interesting, like the Scan Pyramids project in Egypt that you may have heard of, discoveries of new chambers in these pyramids. I'm just going to show you a patchwork of a few photos and super brief videos showing different aspects of what I've been doing. Greenland a few years ago, I was with bird scientists putting satellite transmitters on the back of birds, very light, so don't be worried, they don't suffer at all. And looking at the migratory path of these birds and trying to understand how the warming of the climate is changing the behavior and the migratory patterns of these birds. This happens to be the northernmost point of land on Earth, which is in northern Greenland, and that's one of the part of the world we were looking at, knowing that some bird species, like the ivory gulls, are going more north and north and north as the climate is warming, but eventually they won't have anywhere to go and they will probably disappear as they won't have the cold temperatures they need to survive. So, quick video also about the bear we studied there on the northeastern part of Greenland. They tend to go more and more on land because they have less ice to live on and walk on to hunt seals. Hence, they than more and more to go, and near villages also eat eggs from birds' nests, because that's all they can find, which obviously has an influence on these bird species. Another example is the glaciers of Rwenzori in Uganda, not quite as high as Kilimanjaro, but the last glaciers in Africa. They'll probably be gone in the next 10-20 years. So an expedition I did 3 years ago through the mountains, a student invited from the University of Kampala, looking at how the glaciers behave. One of the first uses of drones then, 3.5 years ago. And this is what's left of the glacier. And again, 10-20 years, like Kilimanjaro, probably all gone for this old ice. And at the summit, not quite K2, what, about 3 kilometers lower than K2, but quite high for me. Another expedition 3 years ago was South Georgia, in the footsteps of Shackleton. You probably have all heard of this famous explorer. So in these footsteps, we did some quite interesting science there. On the ocean, there was a part which was retracing the crossing of the island, at the same time taking snow samples, which were analyzed at the CNRS in Paris, and also deploying floats. That's Hamilton, and the area where we were, looking at penguins. And that's the floats that we deployed, Argo floats, which send their position and hence temperature, current, speed, salinity, and a lot of parameters to a network of open source science data. And last one here, yes, Cuba was last July. The idea was to look at the situation of coral reefs in Cuba, which are the best preserved in all the Caribbean. So I went with 3 scientists, 2 robotics, 3D photographing, mosaicing experts from University of Sydney, and 1 from the Scripps Institution in San Diego. For 10 days, we surveyed sample positions in the coral. Want to put it back? Yeah. So it consists of, spiraling around a very defined position with this 3D equipment, and the idea is to come back, in a year, 2 years, every few years, and see how things have changed. Some of the companions that we have there when we do our work, another less friendly one, but still interesting to, talking about fear and risk. It's interesting to go meet these particular animals. Lionfish, a big issue in the Caribbean, if you don't know, not native to the Caribbean, came from the Pacific Ocean, and now totally invasive in the Caribbean, and it's a big problem because they are top of the food chain and they're eating everything they can, so that's a big issue in the Caribbean. Explorers Club flag, and last one, from this past September, the idea was to go in the Russian Arctic. I'd never been to the Russian Arctic, and I wanted to, it was kind of missing in my bucket list of Arctic places where to go. Went in the footsteps of Georges Delong, who is less known than Shackleton, but was quite an explorer himself in 1879, 81. Went to these totally remote islands northeast of the Russian Arctic. It's going to be a film in about 3 months, which will come out. This is Alexei Molchanov, a world freediving champion. We did some pre-screening of a zone where the wreck of the Jeannette, the ship of Delong, might be, with the goal of coming back either this summer or summer 2019 in that region to actually look for that wreck. And there was with human traces on these islands, pre-modern time. So we took some samples of bones and stones, which are currently analyzed at the CNRS in Toulouse, to try to understand what's the history of this particular place. Also looking at the mammoth situation there, permafrost, which is a big issue in Russia in particular, knowing that Russia is a 2/3 of permafrost, and that permafrost is melting at an accelerating rate in that part of the world. Voila for me, and next I think is Nathalie. Thank you, Louis.
Some of that stuff looked familiar. I've been around the Russian Arctic. Anyway, it's a fascinating place. Our final speaker tonight is, I think I got it right this time, Nathalie Gibb. She's the last one here. She's a member of the Explorers Club too, so...
I'm not.
You're not?
They just invited me to speak.
Oh, that's right. She spoke on Tuesday night, and I assumed she was a member. But she'll become a member. She's been active in underwater caves since 2009. She's explored over 20 cave systems in Mexico. She owns an outfitter called Under the Jungle, and it's also based in Mexico. So let's hear it for Nathalie.
All right, so my name is Nathalie Lynn Gibb, and I am co-owner of Under the Jungle, which is a cave diving training shop and exploration center in Mexico. And my passion in life is underwater cave exploration, which I know is a little weird. So I live in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, so that's by the big red arrow. And where I live in Mexico, we have the longest and most extensive subterranean flooded cave systems in the world. Okay, here's a map. I lost my connection. Could you? Let's see. Yep, there we go. Okay, to give you an example, this is a very small part of one of the longest cave systems that we have in Mexico. So all those little lines represent underground caves. It's one continuous interconnected network of caves. And this particular one has over 263 kilometers of flooded caves. So it's a lot. All of our caves are decorated, so they're full of stalactites and stalagmites, and they're really pretty. So this whole place is filled with places like this. Ooh, that's me. And this, that's not me. So my team and I have been the first people on the planet to dive, explore, and document more than 20 cave systems. And we've mapped at least 40 kilometers of underground tunnels in the area where I live. This is a list of just some of them. Some of them are extraordinarily beautiful, like this place we named Mukin. But more than being fun and exciting, what underwater cave explorers do has some scientific significance. So in the Yucatan Peninsula where I live, water is a really precious resource, and we have no above ground lakes or rivers in the area. So what this means is that it's really hard to know where the water flow is happening and what's going on in the aquifer. And this is a good example of it. We have a 4-kilometer cave system under the jungle in this place, and you can't see any trace of it on land. So it's really hard to know. And understanding groundwater flow is really, really important in my area as it becomes developed. It's important to understand groundwater flow because we need to manage sewage and contamination, and also because all those underground rivers flow out onto the coral reefs in the beautiful Caribbean, onto the second largest barrier reef system in the world, which is the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef. So if they're polluted, the reef is going to die. Also, what we do is really interesting for paleontologists. So above ground in the area where I live, the hot and humid environment does not preserve fossils or artifacts very well. But it's a different story underground in the caves. Underground in the caves that are flooded with water is a static environment. The temperature and the conditions are always the same. So this preserves bones really, really well. So our team has discovered plenty of Ice Age fossils. This is one that we found just this summer, which is a giant ground sloth, and it's complete and articulated, which is really exciting. And this is really useful for scientists to find, because in the past, because there was no artifacts, well, not artifacts, fossils above ground, they couldn't really tell how the animals migrated from South to North America. Once they started looking underground, they started to understand the migration of these Ice Age species. So it's quite interesting. And we have discovered ancient Maya sculptures and artifacts, both at the edges of the cenotes, or the caves, and underwater. The process of locating these caves is really, really interesting. We actually spend more time as an exploration team in small towns and ranches in the jungle talking to locals than we actually do diving, because finding the entrances of these caves is really, really difficult. And really the only people who know where these places are the locals who use them as water sources. So in some way what we do is more cultural exploration than it is cave exploration. From there, once we hear about a cenote, we spend a lot of time hiking in the forest, cutting our way through the jungle with machetes to try to find these holes. And when we do find the holes, actually a lot of the time they don't go anywhere. They just pinch down, or they're collapsed, or they're filled with sediment. So I'd say like 1 out of 20 places we check actually goes. So it gets pretty frustrating, because sometimes it feels like we're getting nowhere. But dealing with frustration and being persistent is something that's really a big part of exploration, as I'm sure you guys will agree. And sometimes it really pays off, and sometimes we find something absolutely new and unique and absolutely worth the effort. And that's the case with this cave that we found a few years ago. I named this place Pandora, and right now it's over 8 kilometers long, and it's still growing. What's really interesting about Pandora is that it's in the south of the peninsula, where pretty much no horizontal caves have been found yet, where people thought there weren't any caves, but really they just weren't looking for them. It also is interesting because it actually starts in a saltwater bay, which is unusual for cave exploration in Mexico. But the weirdest thing about it is it's absolutely filled with bacteria. So you know what the other pictures looked like? Look at this place. So bacteria coats the floors and the walls and the stalactites and the stalagmites. Everything looks a little fuzzy. We've never seen a cave like this. We have no idea what the bacteria is. I've taken samples out. I sent them to Northwestern University with my friend who had a biological sample permit. And I actually get the results back on this speaking lecture trip thing that I'm doing right now in about 3 days in Chicago. So I'm really excited to find out what it is, but I can't tell you yet. It makes exploration in this place really interesting, because when we breathe and when we move, all the bacteria flakes off and falls down around us like rain. It's really beautiful, but it reduces visibility for us as divers on the way out, which means we're usually having to feel our way out, and it makes it a little more difficult in that sense. But it's lovely. So I'm going to show you a video of this place that I'm very excited to have found. This video is from about 3 weeks ago, when we were exploring once again in Pandora. So all the video was shot by me, so I'm not in the video, I'm taking it, of my exploration team as we're exiting the cave after we've mapped it. And the very last shot is Vince, who's my main exploration partner, connecting 2 cave systems. So while we were working on Pandora, we found another entrance to the east of it, and we named that place Melmac. We worked on that cave for a while. We were trying to make the 2 meet. And we accomplished this about 3 weeks ago, over the space of 3 days. So you'll see the little cave maps with the lines in this video, and you'll see them growing as we make the connection. And I think it's fun. So here we go. Those are the 2 caves connected. That's my scientist friend. She was really excited. So you can see all the fuzzy stuff. Super fuzzy. So those are bacterial straws. We're calling them snottites. They're literally like strings of bacteria. They're hanging down and they're flexible and they move and sway as you move past them. It's just the most bizarre thing. So that's bacteria flaking down. My scientist friend was super excited and he'd stop poking the bacteria the whole dive. So that's what we started with. The one on the left is Pandora and the right is Melmac. And those are what we were trying to connect recently. It's really huge. So we got closer. That's the bacteria just floating. So that day we got really close to connecting them, but the visibility was so bad that we stopped 20 feet before we connected the caves and we didn't see the other tunnel. So we had to go all the way back there the next day, which was this huge schlep before we could do it. And then we made it. It was 20 feet away. We felt really stupid. So that's Vince just tying the lines, the cave lines together and making the official connection with the markers that we used to indicate a connection's been made. So it's fun.
Thank you, Natalie. What we're going to do now is I'm going to ask some questions of these three explorers, and we'll do that for about 15 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for you guys to ask some questions. So think of some good ones, okay? Okay. My first question, and I always ask this question of explorers, first of all, what are you afraid of, and how do you handle fear? I'll start with you, Natalie.
Should I need a microphone? Okay, so I have a problem in life, which is I'm really usually not afraid.
Oh, come on, you're afraid of something.
I'm afraid of heights, and I don't like being cold.
And how do you handle fear?
So I just don't think about it. But I'm honestly, in the caves, for example, I am not afraid. I think really a lot of exploration comes down to preparing yourself with training and experience. And when you are in the actual situation that you're doing something, you clear your mind, you focus on the tasks that you're doing, your next step, for me, your next breath, your next movement through the place. And fear does not enter your mind. If you are afraid, you are unfocused and therefore unsafe, and you have no business being in the extreme environment.
Excellent answer. Luke, how about you?
Well, I would be afraid to go where you're going for sure, especially being quite tall and clumsy.
So would I.
I would
No
get
excuse, my husband is your height.
already
He
I would
uses this,
get stuck somewhere. I see you put your tanks on the side, probably not to get stuck.
Yes, it's much more,
Yeah, all
better.
right, I'll try that. Well, in my case, because I go typically with groups, and the fear is more for me being afraid that something will happen to some of the people I'm with, like the younger people or less experienced people that are abroad. So I really feel a responsibility. So it's less a fear for myself, for my body, or for breaking something, although that may happen. So that's the main element. And then it's, I would disagree with Nathalie that I think you need to be afraid, to be kind of a constantly actually being worried most of the time when you're in these environments is probably good, and it's a good evolutionary reflex that we have. which make us prepare. We do obviously a lot of what if something go wrong in the preparation. And actually, interestingly, yeah, I've been in a lot of crazy places and dangerous places, but the only time that I broke something was in a street in Paris, getting out of a meeting.
That's how it always works, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, I was totally, not prepared. I was not afraid of anything. And I trip and I break my arm, and I now have a piece of metal and 11 screws in my right arm, which, never happened in my expeditions. So here it is for fear.
And I guess the way you prepare for fear is, or the way you handle fear is incredible preparation. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yes, absolutely. Going through, what if and a list of things, and you bring everything you can, and yet, as Conrad Anker, that you might know, a famous explorer, a mountaineer in the US, told me, I was in Antarctica with him in 2003. He said you can prepare, everything and think about everything, and there is always something which will happen that you're not prepared for. But being in the business we are, we also have to be prepared for what we've not prepared to be prepared for. So that's interesting. And I'll leave you on that thought.
Vanessa, there's got to be some fear climbing K too.
Okay, well, I'll give you my 2 cents on fear. Real fear cannot be planned or mitigated. Real fear happens to you. And when it does, like when your oxygen is cut off or when you fall, is when your brain says, I'm dying. It's happened to me twice. It cannot be planned and it cannot be mitigated. That's what I'll call physical fear. There is, however, psychological fear. And having led the last 2 expeditions, I struggle with that a lot. I don't like my teams cross-calibrating across teams because they spread fear. What do I mean by that? I mean, avalanches happen every time it snows. And they'll start to panic and say, ooh, there's avalanches. Or they'll see there's no good weather days. Ooh, there's no good weather days. And they'll start talking themselves out of the fact that a summit is possible. Psychologically, they've got to be there for 8 weeks and they start to lose hope. Now, I would rather keep them in camp and focused on the summit than lose them across camps where I can't control their focus and their attention to the summit. So that's psychological fear. And I can distract them and I can keep them focused, but only if they stay in camp. So that's my 2 different variations on that. But real physical fear, which I think is your first question, cannot be mitigated and cannot be planned.
Thank you, Vanessa. I've been told that I have to answer all these questions myself. So while I'll drive a car at 200 miles an hour and I don't have much fear, I'm afraid to go shopping by myself. I'm afraid the salesperson is going to talk me into buying something I don't want. And the way I prepare for that is I bring somebody with me. All right, the next question obviously deals with this whole topic tonight. Each one of you, what are the biggest challenges that your area faces in the 21st century? We'll start with you.
For cave exploration in my area, I would say the biggest challenges that we face right now are the sort of unsustainable development of the peninsula where I live. So right now, the area, particularly the Riviera Maya, is seeing like extreme growth with tourism and sort of less conscientious, shall we say. Companies are buying huge plots of land, and a lot of these have like bulldozing and construction permits grandfathered in. So we're seeing a lot of destruction of the natural environment, and we're losing access to a lot of the caves, and we're seeing a lot of pollution starting to get into the caves. So both the ability to access places as well as the health of the environment is really changing. And there's not a lot we can do about that with the Mexican government. So what we're trying to do now is just encourage people who do own caves to keep them in their communities or within their families and not sell them to these big organizations, which is really difficult to convince people to do because they don't have a lot of money. We've had some success in some of the areas when they realize like this is water. But yeah, so just seeing things get bought up and destroyed is extremely painful.
Well, before I let you go, I mean, don't you get nervous down there that you're going to catch one of your tanks on something, a rock down there in those caves? I mean, that looks just really nutty.
No.
Not at all?
No, you train for this and you choose where you go. So if it's going to be something that's so tight, I don't think I can do it. I just don't do it.
Yeah, you're pretty small. You probably fit through.
I found a sport where it's an advantage to be a small female.
Yeah, I think Luke would have more problem. All right, Luke, what about your area? I'm sure there's a lot of challenges facing polar exploration and global warming in the 21st century.
Yeah, well, there are some places where I've been where I won't be able to go in 10 years, like the glaciers in Rwenzori, they'll be gone. The North Pole, if you want to do it, on the ice during daylight in April, I was there April 11, 2009. In a few years, even today, it's becoming more and more difficult because the ice is very thin and almost watery at that time of the year now. So unless you do it in the middle of the winter, when it's totally dark, which I would not suggest, it's going to be impossible to do. So there are some changes there, so you have to choose your destinations accordingly. There are some political issues, like the Russian Arctic, when you're going to the Russian Arctic, depending on the passport you have, the latest situation, political situation with other countries, the kind of people you're bringing, what nationality they are from, that can be a challenge. And for the ocean part, these are challenges like warming of the ocean and plastic in the oceans and all these things we hear about. It's also opportunities to go and study and race to go explore, explain, show the world what's going on, so that the race to preserve these spaces accelerates. So here it works kind of both ways.
Now, Vanessa, I imagine a lot of some of the same things Luke just said apply to the mountains, with a lot of the glaciers receding and a lot of rock fall and that sort of thing, big mountains.
Yeah, I would say for mountains, the biggest challenge is climate change. I use the word climate change, not global warming, because the minute you say global warming, you'll have POTUS or somebody pontificating.
She's a Republican.
In the negative. And we don't want that. So climate change is an issue, and a mountaineer will see it. Once upon a time, there was ice, and there was snow, and there were things covering these mountains. Now they're mixed climes. It is much more rock and mixed climate, even on the 8,000-meter peaks. So we have to protect these. And whether you're in the Karakoram or whether you are in the Himalayas, these are poor countries. Nepal has 800, roughly, per capita GDP. Pakistan is 1,500 per capita GDP. So both of these countries, in a standard of living comparison, poor countries, and it's harder for them to protect their environment than it is for the wealthier countries. And trust me, what goes in the westerlies, or even in the oceans, I've also done scientific sampling in the Goodwin-Austen Glacier, run these samples through mass spectrometers, and found even Fukushima, the fallout from there, in the Karakoram, which we've also seen in Nepal. So what happens in our weather patterns gets picked up and put everywhere else in the world. They're in our glaciers, which eventually will melt and feed the headwaters in all of our irrigation and drinking waters. So it is a problem, and we have to be careful. When they're big events, they affect everywhere. They become big global events.
Thank you. I'm a generalist, obviously, as an explorer and adventurer, but the area I'm most interested in is space. And what we really face in space travel now is declining interest by the general public. Back in the Apollo program, 5% almost of the GNP was devoted to space. Now it's less than 0.5%. And we're supposed to be going to Mars and doing all this stuff with the space station. We can't even fly our own rockets to the space station. We're relying on the Russians. So the challenge really is to get interest from people and then get the money to do it. And I hope that that happens. Okay, this time I'm going to mix it up. I'm going to start with Luke. Luke, who are the people in your field that you admire and why? Or give me one or two names.
Well, it's interesting because having been through the 20 years of exploring and traveling and looking at historical expeditions and reading books and the Endurance, Shackleton and DeLong and all these guys, I tend to admire more the guys we don't know the names of. You know, they are the number 2 and the guys who, you know, they died, never heard of them. And these guys, I mean, are just amazing. So most people know about Shackleton. Probably no one knows about Frank Wilde. He was his second in command, amazing guy, fantastic guy, and didn't get much credit for everything which was done. Everything goes to Shackleton. And even, you know, below Wilde, there were so many great people in the team. Same for the DeLong expedition in the Russian Arctic. Melville was first, nobody knows about DeLong, but even if they know, they don't know about George Melville, who was the engineer, just an amazing guy who probably saved, you know, all the people who made it alive. So I guess my thoughts would go to all these guys we've never heard of because there was no media, no journal, no one to report back home about them. And in my new field of ocean, Sylvia Earle would be a great name, an amazing lady. She must be like 80 now and still super active and passionate about the ocean, a great scientist, a diver, and a great loudspeaker for the health of the oceans.
I think they call her Deepness.
Yeah.
That's her title. Natalie, how about you?
People that I admire in my field. Okay, so I would say there's 2 sides of this. The first is that as a cave diver, we rely on a process called accident analysis, which is basically look at how people had problems and we try not to do that again. And the person who really started this process of accident analysis was a mathematician and sort of the father of modern cave diving, and somebody named Chuck Exley, who I have a great respect for. And he just pushed boundaries and figured out how not to do things by doing them the wrong way, but somehow survived the whole time. So that was great. So he really birthed modern cave diving. I also have great respect for all the people in my life that are starting to mentor me who have managed to turn cave diving into a form of conservation as well. And that's something I want to continue to work towards. So people like Jill Heinrich, who's become a bit of a mentor, really, really inspire me to push myself to go in that direction. And finally, probably the person who I'm most in awe of is my exploration partner, Vince, who's actually French, Vincent Roquette-Catale.
Is he here?
No. But he and I working together have pushed ourselves so far and have encouraged each other to continue pushing ourselves and to try new things and to work through all the other caves that we have found. So without him, I wouldn't have done any of this.
Thank you. How about you, Vanessa?
Well, I think I've, over time, become very inspired just by reading books across exploration. So, you know, whether it was Perry or Cook or Amundsen or Shackleton, if it was the Mountaineers, I find all of them, you know, inspiring because they all brought something interesting to what they were trying to achieve. But I can say it's very, very humbling if you ever visit memorials to, there's always memorials at the bottom of mountains, for example. At the base of K2 is the Gilkin Memorial, which has the 87 plaques to those who have died and lost their lives on K2. And I've done historical conservation there, putting up 20 plaques to missing climbers. So that's very humbling because those are real people who climbed before you, and those were across 13 different nationalities dating back 37 years. So as you do that, you understand, like, you know, the year that they climbed and where they came from, the stories, the different expeditions that they were with. And nobody likes to do the graveyard shift or the cemetery work, but when you do, you know, it brings you closer to the history of the mountain, and it's very humbling.
Yeah, I remember when I did the Matterhorn, we went down and we saw the graveyard of many climbers who had died. It was very sobering, but it also made us concentrate like hell when we were climbing it. I guess if I had to say there's a person that inspired me, it was Sir Edmund Hillary. I'll go to the mountains. He was such a humble man, and he was such a big man and a quiet man at the same time. I remember I asked him, you know, when you're on top of Mount Everest, 53, what do you remember most? And he said, well, two things. He said, I remember looking around for any remnants of George Mallory in case he made it, and of course there wasn't anything up there. He said, but the other thing I remember is looking out across the great Khumbu Valley and seeing the peak Makalu and starting to work out a route about how he could climb it. And he said, here I was standing on top of the world, and I was already thinking about another adventure, and I think sometimes this is how adventurers think. So Sir Edmund Hillary would be my guy. Yeah, so James Cameron said, you know, exploration is curiosity in action. And so did John Glenn, and they said it independently. I'll start with you, Vanessa. What do you think? Do you agree with that, or do you have your own definition?
Oh, thanks. Well, so curiosity is an interesting one. As it happens, the Harvard Business Review in December chose curiosity as one of the 5 key characteristics that they looked for in high potentials for the C-suite, which I found interesting. So it's not just curiosity now amongst explorers, it's curiosity now that is what people are on the lookout for success, actually, no matter what you do. So HBR chose curiosity, chose the right motivation, chose insight, determination, and engagement. Those were their 5. But the fact that they chose curiosity, I thought, you know what, Cameron's got something on that. I would say that there's a lot about curiosity in terms of defining success for an individual, no matter what they do.
Luke?
Yes, I mean, totally curiosity has been a key word, a operating word in my vocabulary for many years. I don't want to say I coined the term CQ, curiosity quotient, talks before, but...
Did you invent the internet?
No, I'm sure other people have used that before, but anyway, that's something I've used, and for me it's more important, and I consider myself having a average IQ, but a very high CQ, and if I would say if I had twice the IQ but half the CQ I have, I would not be where I am today, whether in business or in exploration. So I always tell my daughters, be curious and go and explore and dare and be nosy, at the risk of being obnoxious. But just do it. It's gonna pay off. Just this itching for the unknown, which is in most of us, and that we should act on. So to speak.
How about you, Natalie?
I think this is a really funny question because I'm going around speaking all over the place for a month, and my conclusion of my speech is that people need to stay curious. So I absolutely agree. I think curiosity is a definitive human trait. I think it's my most favorite one. And I think without curiosity or interest in the world, we become stagnant as individuals and as a society. I think the world is still very vast and very mysterious. I think there's plenty of exploration to be done, both from the intricacies of the human body to the deep ocean to underwater caves. And I think everybody has to find that spark, that thing that makes them curious, and we should all just go for it and explore it. We have more time now as a species, now that day-to-day tasks are more automated and day-to-day survival is no longer such an issue, to devote energy to these pursuits. So let's all explore.
Okay, well, that's a good answer. Curiosity in action, definitely agree with it. Done a lot of stuff I was curious about. One time I wanted to try figure skating. I did a deal with Sasha Cohen, the Olympic silver medalist from Torino. And I thought it would be really easy, and I had never been on skates. And she had me out there trying to do a spin. And the next thing I knew, I was in an ambulance heading to the hospital with a level 3 concussion. So never underestimate these little escapades that we do. But yeah, that was my curiosity, and the action was ending up in the hospital. I have one more question of you guys, and I'm going to open it up to the audience. Let's see. It's this one. Actually, maybe I
I
don't.
think it's 4.
I've done 4. Okay, that's it. Let's have a big hand for these guys. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, we have
Oh, you have a mic? Okay.
So I too am a member of the Explorers Club. I'm very interested in this idea of fear. Jim, you know that if you had fear driving that car, you shouldn't be driving it. I'm a former race car champion, and we used to say that as soon as you get afraid, get out of that car forever. Now I want to know from Vanessa, what do you think? When you, I believe the number is 1 out of every 5 people who have climbed on K2 are dead.
1 out of every 4.
Yeah.
1 out of every 4. Excuse me. Does that play in, and how does that play? I mean, I know it does works with your preparation and all of that, but what really goes on back there?
Yeah, so statistically, what we're referring to is for every 4 that climb, 1 dies, right? So, and that's, I talked about the 87 at the Gilby Memorial and doing the graveyard shift and taking care of those memorial plaques. I know intimately all of those deaths. I've walked by them, I've lit candles for them, I know all of those deaths. I also know all of the summits, because I've mapped every one of those summits against all of the days of the summits, because I'm a numbers person. I was in finance, right? So of course I'm looking, 58% of summits happen between this window and that window, right? I'm putting that against all the actual weather dates. I've got data, I've got so much data, right? But that's why, fear, people are obsessed with this fear, but it really, Nathalie touched on it. We're prepared. And, the actual summit day, that video, that last 1,000 meters is 16 hours one way.
Wow.
16 hours. When I showed you that shitty last Thursday, right? Sorry, bleep. Those conditions, imagine being outside for 16 hours uphill with 1/3 of the oxygen at sea level.
But didn't you have to come down then?
No,
23 hours?
23 hours round trip. Coming down in the dark. There is no time to have fear enter that mind. So if you get distracted and psychological fear enters, you have to put it on a boat, get it out of your mind, or count. Row, 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 row your boat is a circular reference. It doesn't go anywhere. You can sing 99 bottles of beer because that'll take you from 99 to 0. But you have to do something count. There was some great snipers that were talking about in the military. They count 0 to 1,000, 1,000 to 0, because they're looking at the desert out of a helicopter, and they can't differentiate. When we climb at night, we can't differentiate. We can't differentiate the snow from the cloud, the night sky. So the mind has to stay focused, and you're out there for 16 hours in a blizzard. We saw some of the whiteout conditions. You can't lose your concentration or your focus. And no matter how uncomfortable you are, you have to just stay where you are and take that 1 step, 5 breaths, 1 step, 5 breaths. You gotta go there fully.
And walk here.
You are great. I have a question for you. How did you feel on top of K2 versus on top of Jumarama? Everest.
Okay, so in Hollywood films, in Hollywood films, when you're at the summit, everybody's like, oh yeah, you know, high fives, and they're dancing, and they're singing, and they're hugging, and this does not happen in reality. Not at all, on any mountain, because you are so knackered and so exhausted. What happens is you get there, and you remember the stuff in your pack, and it's gotta come out, because you might have a sponsor if you're really lucky, but probably not, because what if she dies? Nobody wants to sponsor that. But you do want to take out your country flags, you want to take out your host country flags. I had UN Women. Woohoo! You got to get that stuff out of your pack, right? That is the most important thing. You probably are not even going to take a sip of water, or the water's frozen. Whatever's with you to eat is probably frozen. Get that stuff out of the pack and then get the hell down.
But the difference, did you find any difference between being on the top of Everest and the top of K2 in terms of your emotional feelings?
I think on Everest was my first and the only one I ever wanted. I was with, you know, and it happened the first time I tried for the actual peak. Yeah, I was probably psychologically happier on Everest, if that makes sense. My camera froze, my camera batteries froze, but the Finnish guy who followed me up took my picture and proceeded to copyright it, which is funny. But anyway, you know, he took it, I was happy, and you know, it was great. It was a great feeling. I think I was happy, and I felt really good. And it was only 8 hours up. It took twice as long to get to K2 in 3 years. So I think I was more angry on K2.
Yes.
So you said at the beginning of your presentation that when you change your life from financial services to climbing, you didn't know if you could learn it and if you will like it. So obviously you learned it. What it is that you like? And in fact, the question works also for Luke and Nathalie. What is it that you really like in what you're doing?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of that, there's nothing harder, because it really challenges everything. It challenges, you know, I saw a TED Talk recently. It was wonderful. It was a guy in Argentina, and he was doing it as a comedy. And he said, what is it about a mountaineer? They go up there, they have this horrible weather, they risk frostbite, it's like they spend $100,000. They could have been on a beach having a margarita, yet they go up and they do it again. And you couldn't stop laughing when he did it, because it's the most ridiculous thing when you say it like that. Who would do that? That's the definition of insanity, right? But it's the pursuit of the ultimate goal, because there is nothing harder that will challenge you physically, psychologically, spiritually, and mentally. Nothing that will hit every one of those aspects. So for me, it's that.
What I like to think about with mountain climbing, it's, I think of it as the Puritan work ethic. You know, the mountain doesn't care whether you're going to suck up to it like you might to your boss. Doesn't care how much money you have, although Everest does cost a lot. It doesn't care. It just is there, and when you get to the top, it's the ultimate living out of the Puritan work ethic, and that's why I like climbing. Anyway, Luke, what is your...
Yeah, I mean, for a more generalist as well in, you know, expeditions and exploration, so, but for the more modest mountains I've climbed where I still suffered or fell or got very cold or, you know, storms and all that, I totally relate to what you just said, Vanessa and Jim. But as I do, I think it's also like, you know, being very cold in Antarctica or in the Arctic or in glaciers in these regions. It's kind of a, people ask me sometimes, well, do you like the cold? Oh, you're really lucky. No, I do not like the cold, but it's a kind of a price to pay to be in these regions where it's just magnificent, it's fantastic, it's overwhelming, it's a lot to do, there is virtually no one there because it's cold and difficult. So, you know, it goes with the thing. But there are many other kind of explorations that you can do where, yes, it might be physically demanding, but it's not that difficult. I mean, anybody here could do most of the kind of exploration which is done by members of the Explorers Club, I would say. It can be going in a Gobi Desert and look for tombs of Gengis Khan, or there are so many things to do which don't require to be Superman and go to the gym every day.
Just curious.
Exactly.
Is this to me now?
It's to you.
Okay, well, my environment is maybe not as physically challenging as your environment. So I think there's two aspects of exploration that are interesting to me. The first is, I'm privileged to see an entirely untouched place on the planet that no human has ever been before, ever. Who wouldn't want to do that? Come on, right? But the other thing, I think, is that because it requires such a sharp mental focus, that when I'm actually diving in the cave, it's a almost meditative experience. You have to clear your mind of everything but what's going on, and the environment forces that. So it eventually becomes a type of freedom. Your edges dissolve and you are just thoughts and breath and free for as long as you're there. You're just paying attention to the environment around you. So maybe that's something that's common for all people that go into extreme environments. I think they force a bit of a meditative mind state. You guys could tell me if I'm wrong, when you're in them or when you're in that challenge. Maybe that's part of the attraction to me.
Other questions? Yeah, right here.
First of all, congratulations to all your great accomplishments. Tough to top what you've already done. But I was wondering what you might have identified as a future challenge to you, for all three of you, all four of you. What's next?
Well, I have about 20 cave systems that are not finished exploring, so I'm still working on all of those. There's tunnels going everywhere, and we're continuing. We have a really big project where Pandora is. I've identified maybe about 7 or 8 other potential outlets into the same bay. It's super expensive for me to go out there, so I'm currently trying to write grants to places like Nat Geo and things to see if I can get some funding so that I can afford the boat trips out to the openings so I can go put more line and dark holes in the ground.
Thank you. Well, in my case, it's a combination of new places where to go, and there are plenty, contrary to what people said. A lot of the world has not yet been walked on or climbed or attained. I'm also looking at going back to some of the places where I've been, like the Russian Arctic, to do more, to look for that wreck of this 1879 expedition, or Cuba, to look at the scientific data, again, collect more data. So it's another aspect of future projects. And also, as I said earlier, I like to write books and photography and do documentaries now. And I'm looking at new formats to communicate. And the film I'm preparing on Cuba, which will be out in a couple of months, is actually a combination of a documentary and fiction. So trying to mix genres to make it more accessible to the general public. So it's not just the novelty is not just in where I'm going, but how I'm going to talk about it in the future to the general public.
Vanessa?
Thank you. I don't have a what's next because I just finished K2. So, but I will say, funding is an issue for any of the 8,000 meter peaks, and it's an issue because mountaineering involves high risk. So I find sponsors shy away from the risk, even though you can sit across a board and talk intelligently, and you can mitigate the risk by pulling back on the social media until you're safely back down or even back home. But there'll be somebody around a board table who will say, "What if she dies?" And it's just hard to get past that conversation. Yet there's no better story than the determination, the strength, the effort, and all of that great stuff, plus getting to the top and taking a product or testing a product and everything that goes with getting to the top. So mountains are tough, but there are other, exploration things out there. So I'll leave that into the next chapter and see what comes up.
Back in 1998, I was lucky enough to fly in a MiG-25 Foxbat, Russian fighter jet up to 85,000 feet above the Earth at Mach 2.6. And what I saw up there was a beautiful scene of the curvature of the Earth and the atmosphere, which is very thin, hanging over the Earth, and the blackness of space. And so for me, I've been trying desperately to get into space, which would be the Virgin Galactic ticket I bought in 2010. I'm waiting. The rocket blew up in 2014 and they had to rebuild it. Branson's trying his best. He says he's going to go on the first flight with his son. That makes me feel better. I'm passenger number 610, but my next adventure, my next big bucket list adventure, whenever it happens, would be to fly in space. One more question. Yes, right here.
Hi. My name is Allison. Thank you each for, I'll stand up, for sharing your explorations. They were incredible stories. You're obviously each accomplished, and congratulations on making exploration part of your career, second career. Vanessa, I love the quote that you cited from, I think, Bill Gates about failure. And I'd be curious to know if you'd each be willing to share potentially from earlier on in your careers as explorers, a time where you failed or something went wrong and how you dealt with it and what you learned from it.
Sure, I can start. My goal was Everest. So when I first trained up to take my mountaineering course, I thought, well, where should I take this newfound skill? Why not Everest? Not to the summit, but the way they sold Everest was to base camp, Camp 2, or to the summit. So having taken a mountaineering course, I booked for Camp 2. And the reason for that was because I had already climbed Kilimanjaro, so I had technically been to 20,000 feet. So Camp 2 would have taken me to 22, that's 2,000 more, but it would get me on the ice and snow. So I had sound rationale, and I had already been to high altitude. What I hadn't seen, and what was a straight red card in sporting analogy, was the Khumbu Icefall. The Khumbu Icefall is kind of a shifting three-dimensional maze of, kind of towering seracs, which is the first thing that happens out of Everest Base Camp. So everything was fine. I went right up, to base camp, which was fine. But once I got into that icefall, I got into an avalanche, and it was more than I could handle. And an icefall is a terrible place to have an avalanche because it's not like somewhere you can self-rest and put an ice axe in and save yourself, because there's lots of crevasses, there's ladders, there's things that can topple over you, and there's just not the obvious thing to do. So I contracted pulmonary edema, I was hypoxic, I had so many things wrong with me. And that's where success makes a lousy teacher. I ate my humble pie. I was very, very sick. I went my 60 miles back down and plotted in my head everything that went wrong, what I did wrong, but made that promise that I would come back and do it right.
Luke?
Thank God, not too many failures, but if I look at the exploration world of the last 20 years, probably the most impactful for me was in Antarctica. Was there with two friends, a guide and another friend, trying to summit Mount Vinson, that you all know, and which is a relatively easy mountain by mountaineering standards. Even though it's totally remote, it's only about 5,000 meters. And we were roped, the two of us. I was in the middle, we're 200 meters from the summit, and was almost an easy walk to the summit. And right there, my partner in the back just slipped on ice and brought us all down a couple hundred meters, and we hit a rock, and I got a bit bruised and the jacket totally damaged, which is a problem in Antarctica because that's what's preventing you from getting very cold. Our guide was totally bruised and had to stop. So from there we had to go down, and that was the end of my summit. And that really affected me for a while, for weeks if not months, and I wrote about it in one of these books. And after a while I thought, hey, who cares if you submitted or not? You did a great, it was a great project, a great adventure. And I really learned from that I can understand why you want to submit K2, because it's so much investment in time, it's 3 years of preparation, it's lots of money, it's really your goal. But if you have to turn down 30 meters from the summit, 200 meters because something goes wrong, hey, there are plenty of other things to do, and that's life. By the way, talking about preparation, it could have been very, very bad, like we died because we didn't have helmets, because who would take a helmet on Mount Vincent? There is nothing which is going to fall. There's no rocks, it's only ice and snow. And when we fell, we were really, half a meter away for our heads to hit rock. And if it had been rock instead of just snow and ice, one of us would have had an exploded head and would have died. So that's one thing, we did not think of, let's bring a helmet to go to Antarctica. So just referring to your earlier question about fear and preparation.
Nathalie?
So with cave diving, with cave exploration, you're trying to continue your explorations, find the next tunnel, find what's around the next corner. So for me, I would say I have failed so many times, because one of the things with cave diving that you have to do is you have to have the mental discipline to turn around and leave when the first thing goes wrong, right? So we carry redundant to everything, and you're going to be fine to get out if you turn around and leave when the first thing goes wrong before anything else goes wrong, because you'll make it out because you planned this. So the difficult thing is when you've been waiting to go back to a place for 3 or 4 months, for a year, and you get there and everything is prepared, and then one tiny thing goes wrong, and you have to have the mental control to turn around and leave. It's very much like what you've been saying. And it's very difficult to do that, but I've always succeeded to do that, which is probably why I'm still here. And I guess what I've learned from that is that this is a physical place. It's not going anywhere. If it's important for me to go back, I will get back there. So I've learned more than anything, the caves have taught me persistence, I think, and humility, the two together. Yes, you can't go today, that's okay, you're not good enough, you didn't prepare well enough, that's fine. You go back, you get better, you try it again.
That's a great answer. For me, a couple of years ago, I was asked to go bullfighting, the Professional Bull Riders Association. And,
that's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I went in the ring with this giant bull, and he got me in the back of my ribs and broke 3 of my ribs. I was thrown up against a wall. And what did I learn from that? Never get into the ring with any kind of wild animal. All right, that's all the questions we have. Thanks for coming. And I hope to see you. It was a real honor here to do this at the French Consulate. So come back.